Hi. When people do business internationally, they often think about differences in culture, language, and other what I would call touchy-feely things. But in most cases, the things that matter most, actually, are things that are much more tangible. Differences in, for example, laws, right? Legal systems, political system differences, even things like, for example, perceptions of ethics, but not from the perspective of culture, but more from a perspective of what is good and what is bad, what is allowed and what is not. In today's lecture, we'll look at those things, the role of politics, law, and perceptions of ethics in international business. Before we get into all those details, I would like to briefly review the take-home assignment that you will be working on based on this chapter. The idea of the assignment is very simple. The question is basically, what if the United States became a socialist country? And I know most of you, being from the United States, cannot simply take the word socialism. And I'm with you on that one. I don't like socialism myself. And this is why I'm in this country and not in one of the many socialist countries in which I've lived before. But, and this is again a very big but, as my kid says, but there are many people on this planet who genuinely believe that socialism is a better system. Most of the Europeans do, most of the Asians do, even Canadians seem to prefer socialism to some extent, is definitely more than Americans do. And so your task on this one will be to defend your point of view. So basically you will have to defend why capitalism or socialism, if this is what you prefer, is a better system. But unlike people who talk about it on the radio or in political ads before elections or of that kind, so you will be required to talk like a scientist or talk like someone who actually knows what you're talking about. So rather than using all that ideological slur, you will have to actually use facts and figures. And so your job will be to, in this case, to plan a scenario for what's going to happen if the United States became a socialist country. As you understand, and hopefully by now you got the point, that every time we talk about issues of international business, there is someone who loses and someone who wins. Job outsourcing, good or bad? Well, it depends on who you are. If you're a guy in China, maybe it's good because you get a job. If you're a guy without much education in the United States, well, maybe it's bad because you lose your job. If you're a company owner in the United States or in China, it's good because it gives you more money, more profits. And company owners in the United States are as important as Americans as are blue-collar workers. So it's not always good or bad. It depends on who you are and how you're impacted by that decision. So for the take-home assignment here, based on Chapter 3, you will have to answer questions. What would be the impact of socialism or more social policies in the United States on all kinds of outcomes or stakeholder groups? Employees, employers, self-employed businesses, self-employed people and small businesses, what effect it would have on unemployment, wages, prices, productivity, economic cycle fluctuation, long-term economic growth, quality of life overall, and that kind of stuff. Now, for all of these, you would actually probably have to do some research online. So, for example, when the question is what effect it would have on long-term economic growth, well, the only way really to answer that question is not to, speak from your heart. In this case, your heart doesn't matter. You would have to, for example, find out what was the economic growth in countries that have a more socialist system, like, for example, European countries, particularly Northern Europe. Quality of life overall. Again, you know how to measure quality of life, and we've discussed a number of indicators last lecture, including, for example, Human Development Index. Simply look at the differences among the more socialist and more capitalist countries and see which group has a higher HDI. And so if the United States were to become more socialist, chances are it would end up where the socialist countries currently are. The same applies to wages, unemployment, prices, and stuff like that. So for most of that, you would need to look up those numbers on the internet. Also remember that what we call socialism is not an evil, politically charged term. It's a specific set of policies that, again, many people may perceive as evil, and maybe even rightfully so, but again, try to put that ideology aside and focus specifically on the specific policies. And so in this case, what we mean is that That means that the United States will have higher taxes, particularly on the high earners, but that money will be used to fund universal health care, free education at all levels, as it is, for example, in Europe, free employee retraining and special training programs. Again, some of that, by the way, already exist in the United States, but again, it will be even more widespread. Comparatively generous extended unemployment support, government-funded programs, and all that kind of stuff. Plus, there will be probably some state-owned companies that will deliver goods and services, particularly in strategic areas. So things like, for example, defense or air and space or exploration or energy. Again, that already exists to some extent in the United States, more so in Europe, and so here it will be even more so in the United States, so more like the European model. And all those other things described in the assignment. So as I will be teaching the lecture or talking about the things covered in the lecture, just keep those questions in mind and maybe even take notes if you hear something that you can use in your take-home assignment. So first, let me give you a few examples of how these differences may play out in the real world. So just a few real-life examples. For example, political and economic systems, as you understand, differ drastically, and the tools and skills that you would need to do business in these different regions will be substantially different. For example, where would you rather do business, in Sierra Leone or in Finland, and why? I'm not sure what your answer is, and frankly, in this specific case, I don't care because either answer is correct. But as you're thinking about where you would rather do business, you probably focus on things like, wow, those are two very drastically different environments. Finland is very stable, Sierra Leone is not. Political risk is very different. So obviously you would be making your decision based on all that assessment. Interestingly, those people who choose to do business in Finland tend to believe that because it's safer, to do business there is easier. But what they often forget that in Finland, being a stable and and economically prosperous country, you will have a very strong competition. I mean, everybody wants to do business there. If you dare to do business in Sierra Leone, and I'm not saying that you should, but if you do, chances are you will be the only business company there, the only service provider in the country. And your premiums, your profits will definitely be much higher. Well, one morning you may not wake up, obviously because it's so risky, but then again, as long as you stay in business, you may actually do fairly well. Laws will be different, and since we're in North Carolina, I'd like to use an example that relates to the main industry of this state. For example, cigarettes. When I came to Canada for the first time in 2003, one thing that I noticed was packages that looked like this lined by most of the trash cans. And I wasn't sure what that is. I mean, obviously that's something that people use, and when they don't need it or when it's all used up, they just put the package in the trash can, and sometimes they miss, so they lay by the trash can. But I couldn't figure out what those were. The images, as you can see, or hopefully you can see on the low-res video that I'm showing you, obviously portray the negative effects of smoking. So rotten teeth, and you probably understand what the cigarette here symbolizes. And so I naturally assumed that those were packets or packages from something like Nicorette or some other products that are designed to help you quit smoking. How surprised I was when months later I figured or found out that those were actually cigarette packages. So in the United States or in Europe, when you have a pack of Marlboro or any other cigarettes, you would actually see the brand name right there, and there will be lots of information about the cigarette. And then maybe somewhere in fine print, there will be a note that the Surgeon General advises you against smoking. Well, in Canada, the law is that 70% of the cigarette package surface is devoted to anti-tobacco information. And so when you look at the actual package, it all looks anti-smoking very much. And frankly, I don't even know how can anyone smoke cigarettes with all those horrible images on the package. But again, it's not to make a point that Canadian laws are better or American laws are better. It's about the differences. So if you're, for example, tobacco product maker, and you want to sell your product in Canada, at the very least, you will have to redesign your package, so it will be very different. Another example is, well, what constitutes a bribe? When does a gift become a bribe? Imagine that, I do business, for example, with a company here in Greensboro. They, hired me as a consultant or asked me to do something for them. As a sign of appreciation, I give them a little gift, a pencil with the UNCG logo on it. Would that be a gift or would that be a bribe? Would that be too much or not? Or maybe if you, I don't know, as a sign of appreciation, gave me a pencil or a pen like this at the end of the semester, would that be acceptable or not? Well, most people probably would say yes, it's acceptable. It's a little gift, no big deal. What if it was let's say, a backpack with the UNCG logo on it? Would that be too much or would that be still okay? What if it was a leather jacket with the UNCG or Brian logo on it? Would that be okay or would that be too much? What if it was a car with Brian logo on it or maybe without any logo on it? Would that be too much or would that be still acceptable and considered a gift? Again, regardless of what your answer is, you understand that there is a line that you have to draw somewhere, right? So at some point a gift becomes too much and will be considered a bribe. Well, it turns out that in different cultures, the definition of bribe or when a gift becomes a bribe differs dramatically. And I'll actually have a few specific examples later on in the lecture. And so again, depending on that definition, you may go to jail or you may not go to jail, literally. And so those are all important and interesting questions that we'll discuss today. And then obviously the interplay of the three. So sometimes all three come together. Like you, for example, heard about the ordeal that Yahoo and Google have gone through in China. Chinese government requested that these companies provide information about the users, searches that they conducted, information they posted. And so the question becomes, should Google and Yahoo or any other information technology provider, should they share information about their users or not with the government? The law requires that they should. Ethically, well, it depends on how you define ethics. My favorite actor and hero, Jackie Chan, who is a Chinese national, I believe he actually grew up in Hong Kong, but at this time that's one country. So he believed that not only legally but ethically, Chinese people shouldn't be allowed all the freedom that some of them demand. I completely disagree with him on this one, but apparently there are people there who may think that way. So if you, like me, disagree with that statement, well, there may be many people there who will disagree with you. And obviously, as I said, the laws will be not on your side. So all those questions are very important ones and do have important implications for business. So let's talk about the main political systems and how these things differ across those political system spectrum. So obviously we have three main types. So we would have dictatorship on the one extreme, we would have chaos on the other extreme, and democracy more in the middle. Many people believe that it's all about democracy and dictatorship, but as you understand, if you take democracy too far, it will become an anarchy. And so the question is, which of these systems is the best? And more importantly, define best. So the big question is, how do you measure bestness or superiority? What kind of stuff would you be looking at or measures you would be looking at? And then again, probably most people would agree that each of these systems has some advantages and some disadvantages. And so we'll discuss those today. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of each system? Who wins, who loses, and how do you do business in all of them in case you have to? Now, first, let me ask you a question that is likely to appear on the exam in some form as your bonus for watching this video lecture. Which of these types is the United States? So what kind of democracy does the United States have? Well, obviously the answer is B, right. Obviously the United States has representative democracy. Pure democracy doesn't really exist anymore. It existed in maybe ancient Greece. There is a similar type, or almost the pure type, in Switzerland today. They have this weird system where they would vote on just about anything. You know, like new road, should we build it or not? Well, let's hold a referendum. New school, just about anything, even the tiniest things. So they actually have, I believe, like 600 referendums a year. So there are several going every day. People vote online, obviously, and so just about any type of decision they would have a referendum. Obviously, a system like this, even though it sounds wonderful in theory, in practice probably wouldn't work very well, because not only it would be very difficult to implement from the technical point of view, in particular if you have a country like the United States, a large one, but also from the perspective that not all people are knowledgeable enough about all those issues to make knowledgeable decisions. I mean, if you were asked about whether or not a road should be built somewhere in southern North Carolina, I mean, come on, have you ever been there? Do you know what's the conditions there? I mean, if that road should truly be built or not. So, I mean, we have limited information, and if we were asked to vote on each of those topics, it would be just too difficult to do. So we normally rely on what we call representative democracy, where we elect people whom we think will have enough information about the decisions and enough expertise to make good decisions, and whom we trust to make those decisions on our behalf. So let's talk about each of those systems and pros and cons of each of them. And I'm going to start with totalitarianism. Looking into historic perspective, I mean, these people have been perceived as dictator at different times. And I'm not sure if you know all of them. This would be Lenin, that would be Churchill. I'm not sure why he's on the list. I wouldn't say that he was a dictator, just the opposite, but again, depending on how you define it. Mao, Hitler, Mussolini, Putin is here on the list too. Again, some people adore him, but then again, most of the dictators are adored by many people. Others perceive him as a dictator. Doesn't really matter who of the people on this list are really dictators. These are just some of the possible examples. The important thing is that there are different types of totalitarianism, and I truly don't like the way the book discusses the differences among them. So I put together a table that gives you a very good, clear explanation of how different forms of totalitarianism differ from one another. First, let's talk about freedom. So there are three basic types of freedom: economic, political, and personal, right? And depending on which type of freedom is restricted, you have a different form of totalitarianism. And by the way, remember this table, because this is something that will definitely be covered on the exam. You'll definitely have at least one question based on this table. So if the economic freedoms are restricted, then you would have your communism. In a pure example, communism, that's when you can say whatever you want to say. So you have all the political freedom, you have all the personal freedom. You can, shave your head whichever way you want. You can worship whichever god you want. But you cannot own property. So economic restrictions on economy, restrictions on owning means of production, and freely engaging in economic interactions would be completely limited. And so that's your pure form of communism. Obviously, again, if you look at the historic perspective or examples, you would normally see that the Communist parties tended to be also very restrictive from the point of view of politics. There would be only one party, and that would be the Communist Party, as we now have China, or before that Soviet Union, or the same way in North Korea, and so on. And then personal freedoms would often be completely restricted. So when I was growing up in the former Soviet Union, we all had to wear uniforms to school, and you couldn't have hair longer than church standard and all that kind of stuff. So obviously you couldn't dye your hair and do all other things that normally would be considered to be your personal choices. But again, in a pure form, communism, that's economic freedoms limited, everything else unrestricted. So-called right-wing totalitarianism, that's the one that restricts political freedom but keeps everything else free. And again, some of the examples that many people would say would be, for example, modern-day Russia. Economically, fairly free. Personally, come on, do whatever you want to do. But politically, no. There are multiple parties in paper, but try to go and say something against the ruling party or the ruler, the person in charge, which is Putin again. And you may literally vanish. And again, it's probably not a clean example. I mean, Russia is not as dictatorial as many people portray it, definitely not as dictatorial as some other examples from the history. But you've seen probably many examples, or can think of many other examples, where it's a true dictatorship. And again, in a pure way example, it would be political restriction, but economically and personally the life is free. But again, historically, those don't exist in pure forms, and normally you would have some form of restriction on economic and political and personal expressions and freedoms. Theocratic dictatorship, that's the one that restricts your personal freedoms but keeps everything else relatively free. A good example would be today's Saudi Arabia. Economically, very free. I mean, you can do business with the Saudis and you can do business in Saudi Arabia, so no big problem there at all. Politically, even though it's a monarchy, but it's still a fairly free country. I mean, there are multiple parties and there are many choices that you can make with respect to political life. But personally, not that much. I mean, if you're a woman and you wanted to appear in a, I don't know, in bikini on the streets, you may literally be arrested and put in jail. And again, right or wrong, well, I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying that there are certain personal choices that are restricted in that country, whereas the rest of the other domains of life are fairly free. Finally, tribal types of dictatorship or totalitarianism. And that's when all the freedoms are restricted, but only for people who belong to a certain group, or those who do not belong to the ruling tribe or belong to an oppressed tribe. The example would be Rwanda. You probably have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, and you may even know more about the story than the movie told you. But as you remember, there were two groups of people, two ethnicities that largely were divided into those two groups based on an arbitrary measure. And I'm not going to go into the details, but that's the point. And so first one was perceived to be superior and oppressed the other group, and then the other group tried to take to revenge and basically try to oppress the original rulers. And so in this case, depending on which group you belong to, you may be allowed or not allowed to do certain things. And so your kind of ethnic origin or your membership in certain organization may restrict your freedoms in many ways across all domains of life. Now, when I ask students which of these is the worst, I normally hear all kinds of things. Many people believe that communism is the worst, and so that's basically what we've heard about for many decades. I personally find tribal dictatorship or totalitarianism to be the worst, even though all of them are bad. I mean, this is just completely absurd. I mean, that's the extreme form of racism. And I just don't see any slightest ideological justification for this form of totalitarianism. It's not that I justify the other ones, but at least there is something there. We can say, oh, we believe that shared property is good. And yes, we know that historically it didn't quite work out with communism, but at least I can see some, lunatic logic in that. But when you say that people of certain color or, ethnicity should not be allowed to participate, for example, in life fully, I mean, I don't see who benefits from that. I see how the whole society loses. So it's not even that, I'm so sensitive and for justice. It just doesn't make any economic sense. It's completely wrong from all perspectives. But anyway, as I said, any restriction has been historically shown to not lead to any progress or to any good progress. And so I probably would vote against, not probably, definitely would vote against all those types of totalitarianism and totalitarian systems. One interesting example also was that when we talk about totalitarianism, we usually think of some kind of, like lunatic dictator that oppresses his people and, like either Saddam Hussein or some guy in Africa or some guy in Russia who is a total nuts and just basically does bad things. But I once had a student from Israel who said an interesting thing that kind of made me look at this story a little differently. He said, actually, you know what? In Israel, we have tribal totalitarianism. And I looked at him and said, what? And then the whole class said, what? And he said, well, for example, in Israel, some certain positions in the society are restricted to people who are ethnic Jews. And so if you are not a Jew, you cannot basically you cannot hold some of the prominent positions. And yes, obviously, regardless of who you are, your color and stuff, you would be completely free to do anything else in all other domains of life. But at least in politics, that does matter. And again, I'm not sure that qualifies Israel for a totalitarian state. In fact, in my opinion, again, it's probably one of the freer societies, in fact, of most of the free societies. But as what I'm trying to say here is that even the societies that we perceive as the most developed and the most free may have certain limitations, certain restrictions on some things. So I suppose it wouldn't be limited only to mid-century type of organizations, but may also be implemented in modern-day organizations that we may perceive as very free and good examples of free societies. Another student told me that, and likely not improving again, But following September 11th, he is from the Middle East, and he said that he felt here in the United States that he was kind of discriminated against. And again, there was probably some truth to that, and unfortunately, some of the things have been a little bit overblown, and people from Middle East have been perceived by many as a little, potential terrorists, I guess. And obviously, only a very small percentage of Americans thought that way, and so obviously it wasn't as bad as some people portrayed, but probably there was some truth to it. And again, it's good to see that that kind of rhetoric is not acceptable anymore, and so hopefully ethnicity will not play a role in the United States or anywhere else when people are profiled or decided for what they can or cannot do. But again, just to keep in mind that unfortunately totalitarianism exists in some forms, not only existed in the mid-century, but we still unfortunately have some countries like, as I said, Cuba, North Korea, even China, even Russia to some extent today, and some traces of some form of restriction of freedoms may exist even in the most developed countries that we perceive as the best examples of freedom. And so hopefully those things will be taken care of in the future. Now here is another bonus question, and let's see if you can answer it correctly. One of these questions is likely to appear on the exam, and it's as difficult and the same format as the ones you will see on the exam. As I said, I guarantee that there will be one question that is measured, that is based on that table on the previous slide, and that's one of them. So obviously, if you look at the table, limited political freedom corresponds to right-wing totalitarianism. And so the correct answer here would be B. Now, where is democracy and where is totalitarianism? What countries are free and which countries are not free? Can you give me that information right away? Well, this map shows you that information. And if you look at the graph, you would see that the United States, Canada, most of Europe, Australia, many countries in Latin America, and even many countries in Africa are what we would call free, even India or Mongolia. Then countries that are in purple or in orange are not free. And so as you can see, that much of Asia, much of Middle East, much of, all of Russia, as well as much of Africa are considered to be not free by the organizations that do that kind of analysis. My country of origin, Ukraine, right here on this map is portrayed as free, but the map is probably from a few years ago. Unfortunately, the last 2 years actually, with the new guy in the presidential office, I'm afraid the country is no longer qualified to be on the yellow list, to be on the free list, and I would say it's definitely now in the partly free area, and again, hopefully it will change soon. Now, going back to my original question, where would you rather do business? And again, as some people say, well, yellow countries are definitely much more hospitable for business, and that's true. But that also means that there will be more competition in these regions. If you want to do business in the purple regions, the not free ones, you will have a much harder time succeeding. But if you do, you'll probably have fewer competitors, and you probably will be able to charge higher premiums for your services or products. Which ideology is better for economic growth? Well, most people are prompt to say that freedom is associated with economic growth. And definitely when you see the richest regions of the world, like North America, like Europe, like Australia, those are free and rich regions. But then again, there are notable exceptions when you look, for example, at countries like Singapore, China, South Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Those countries have shown a remarkable economic growth, double digits every year for the past who knows how many years. And so some people credit the restricted freedoms and government interventions for that economic growth. Well, when I look at the Middle East, I'd say probably it's not really that much the political system. It's the availability of the natural resources, notably oil and gas, and the increase in prices on those energy and natural resources. But then again, when you look at China, for example, not a particularly energy-rich country, at least not in terms of per capita, as it would be the case in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. But again, it definitely develops very fast. So some people say that perhaps that's because of the government's role in it. Others would actually say that, well, the government's role has diminished dramatically in the last 20 years, and that's when we have primarily seen the growth. When the government was strong and oppressive, there was really no economic growth going on. But I'll leave those questions up to you, and so you can figure that out for yourself. Now, here is another typical exam question. You may see a picture like this, and the question would be, what part of the world is most totalitarian? So if you believe that, for example, A is the totalitarian part, you would choose A. If you believe that it's, for example, B, then you would choose B. And yes, there are two A's and two B's, I know that. But, well, do we have a region that is totalitarian? And the letters correspond to all those totalitarian sectors on the map. And obviously the answer is C. According to the studies, Asia and Africa are more totalitarian, less free than other parts of the world. And I'm not sure what Antarctica is doing here, but obviously C is a better answer here. Now the question is democracy always better? Here in the United States, most people would say, yes, of course it is, and I'm definitely with them. But then again, why not all countries have democracy? Is it too difficult to build, or perhaps those people believe that democracy is not the best? Or it's a combination of the two. So why not all people seem to even want a democracy? Obviously, some people believe that it's difficult to build, but they would aspire to have democracy. I know that would be the case in, for example, Eastern European countries, like, for example, Ukraine. No doubt that most people there, not most, just about all of them want democracy, but they got caught up in that vicious cycle and some of the consequences left after the Soviet Union. And building a democratic state is not an easy task. But then again, if you go to some other countries, it almost seems that many people there genuinely believe that democracy is not a very good system. Now, many politicians have said many times that democracy is not a good system. It's just the best one we've invented so far, but it's definitely not a good one. So again, whatever you believe, hopefully you will be able to defend your point of view in the take-home assignment. When you look at the countries around the world, you would actually see a preference for a strong hand or a good king just about anywhere, especially following the recent crisis. It's definitely the case in many so-called developing countries. But even here in the United States, the ethelon for freedom and choice, even here, many of the policies have been tightened up a little bit, especially following September 11th and then the economic downturn of 2008. The Patriot Act, as many politicians and citizens of the United States now argue, has drastically limited freedoms of the U.S. citizens. And again, I didn't really look into the particulars of that bill, but it seems like it did restrict some of the freedoms. Now, following the 2008 turmoil, for example, financial sector is regulated more tightly. And again, it's obviously still free and probably one of the freest sectors in the world in the United States. But again, it seems like the general public and many politicians supported the idea of tighter control over those sectors. So definitely there seems to be more preference for for restrictions in economic as well as political sectors. Many people just lose trust in free economy and seem to vote for a more controlled economic system. Plus, again, there are many people who just believe that other people are inherently stupid and lazy, and unless you control them, they will not do any good things. And again, I genuinely just believe in that kind of notion, but some people do support it, and so as a result may not prefer democracy but have something. Now let's talk about political risk. That's one of the related dimensions and definitely is part of today's lecture. Political risk relates to conflict and violence and terrorism and kidnapping, all that kind of stuff. So a country, if you do business there, may not be a safe environment for you, so it may be a risk environment. And so risky not only from the perspective of natural disaster, but particularly from the instability arising from a problematic political system. And so that also may include, for example, property seizure. Your property may be nationalized, at the will of the government. Maybe some policies will change. You invest money under the assumption that these are the laws under which you will be operating. And then one day the government chooses to change the laws, and all of a sudden the business is not profitable anymore. Maybe changes in local content requirements. Like, for example, all of a sudden all products sold in the country must contain at least 20-30% of added value generated by the workers or locals in that country. And all of a sudden you don't have enough qualified employees to make a product because locals may not be qualified to do what you want them to do. So when we think about political risk, we normally think about countries, again, somewhere in Africa or maybe Latin America that are perceived as very volatile, very unstable politically. But the reality is that not only those countries may be perceived as politically unstable, but even countries that we may hold as, again, examples of stability. Here is a picture of a recent protest in France. Obviously, it's nothing like, for example, what you would see in Sierra Leone. But even there, if you have a small, for example, shop somewhere in Paris, there is a good chance there will be another riot and maybe your store will be burned. So that's all political instability, political risk. Obviously, it arises from people's resentment toward government. So if you have a country like Thailand, or again at this time it would be a very good example, Ukraine, people hate the government of the country. There is definitely much tension going on, and there is a very, very good chance of some form of a revolution or rioting happening in the nearest future. And so doing business in that environment would be fairly risky. Territorial disputes, Russia and Georgia, for example, 2008, there is a dispute over some territories between the two countries, and as you know, in 2008, it led to a war. And if you were doing business in that region, you literally could end up with a bombshell in your basement. Ethnic, racial, or religious disputes, and Palestine and Israel would be a good example. Again, a very unstable region, and so you don't want to do business there unless you have certain strength and guts. One thing I want to say here is that the United States is very unique from that perspective, and this is something you should be very, very proud about. In the United States, you have a mix of all ethnicities, all races, all religions, just about any type of societal differences. And yet you manage to have the country that is one of the most unified countries. Go to just about any other country in the world, like even Ukraine. It's 99.9% white, 99% Christian, very little differences. And even there, they manage to have sometimes a form of a civil war. And obviously it's not a full-blown war, but people sometimes even get killed, once every few years. Not a huge deal, I suppose, compared to what it could have been. But I mean, if in that homogeneous societies they manage to have such big conflicts, I mean, what would be predicted for the United States? And yet, and again, as I said, you should be very proud of that. The United States is such a stable, unified country. This is a big, big deal, and you should definitely be proud of this aspect of your society. Now, when all those instabilities happen, what that may lead to is that you may no longer be able to secure the natural resources or equipment that you need, or maybe you will not be able to continue on your operations, manufacturing operations, or maybe distribution channels will be cut off, or maybe even your employees' lives will be in danger. So all those important consequences for the business. Now the question is, where is political risk? If I showed you this map, could you pinpoint parts of the world that are politically risky? Most people think of, again, as I said, Africa, maybe Latin America as a risky region, but it's not necessarily the case. As you can see on this map here, the most stable regions are Northern Europe, Canada, and Australia. Also some parts of the Middle East, notably Saudi Arabia. The United States, the rest of Europe, and some parts of Africa and Latin America are actually perceived as the level of risk is low, but not very low. And again, I'm not sure how justifiable that distinction is. In my opinion, America is a fairly unrisky country. But some of the factors that they look at is, like for example, is the country engaged in any armed conflicts? And the United States being currently engaged in a couple of wars, that doesn't raise it on that scale. All kinds of other factors are taken into account, and so the United States is definitely on top of the list, but not on the very top. Where would you rather do business? Again, going back to my original question, well, it depends on you, but obviously profit margins in the purple areas, the countries with a very low risk level, are much lower than profit margins in the areas that are red on this map, very high. When you talk about, for example, the United States or Canada, very stable regions, I mean, here profit margins are often 1% or even less, especially in such industries as retail where competition is fierce. Profit margins for many products are extremely thin, like especially when you go to generic products like what you would buy at Walmart. Try selling that same product in Africa and you can actually have a much, much higher markup. So surviving in the stable environment would take much more innovation, agility, business sense than surviving in an unstable environment. And then obviously again in the unstable environment in parts of Africa, it's just too risky and all the money you make you may lose over in one day. But that's just something to consider. Now let me give you a few examples of specific instances when political risk played out in the economic domain of life. When you, for example, look at the Southeast Asia, as you know, some of those countries have a lot of oil. ExxonMobil, some years ago, had to withdraw from Indonesia, particularly and specifically due to political risk, due to violence against its facilities. As you know, Indonesia is a stable country overall, but many people there perceived ExxonMobil as well as other large companies as modern age colonizers. And they would literally blow up their pipelines and tankers and conduct other acts of violence against the company. And after trying and failing many times, ExxonMobil eventually said, you know what, we've had enough, we are out of here. So the business decision was based purely on non-business factors, or factors that you would be labeling as political or maybe societal, but not economic, not the supply, demand, and availability of resources. Now, another example would go to Russia and Europe. If you have been following politics in Europe lately, you probably would notice that natural gas plays an important role in this region. Unlike oil that is normally transported by tankers or trucks, natural gas is transported by pipelines. And so when you have a pipeline, you can sell natural gas. If you don't have the pipeline, it becomes almost impossible to sell or buy natural gas. Most of the natural gas in Europe is sold from Russia, and there is a pipeline. Actually, there are two, but the biggest one goes through the territory of Ukraine. And so since Europe cannot really buy gas from anyone else, or at least not the needed quantities of natural gas from anyone else, because of the absence of the pipeline to those other sources of natural gas, Europe is largely dependent on Russia's will to sell natural gas and Russia's decisions with respect to the prices of natural gas. Trying to minimize the risk, European leaders were trying to build another pipeline from the Middle East, from Iran and those countries into Europe. So it would be going through Turkey and then parts of the Black Sea bottom, and then a few other countries in the region. And so when those plans became more or less a reality, or when the money started flowing into that project, Russians obviously were not happy about that. Purely business. More competitors, that means that lower profits for everyone, including for them. And so some of the people in Russia, some of the officials, including some of those close to the Kremlin, said things like, if needed, Turkey, Israel, Iran will burn in regional wars, but we won't let the project work. Now, that's political instability. That's not economic feasibility. That's purely political reasons. But once those claims have been made, the Nabucco project was kind of put on hold. Nobody wants to invest a few $1 billion in something that may not work due to political reasons. And so you would think that most of the decisions would be based on economic feasibility analysis, but as you can see, the political risk can play an equally important role. Now, going, for example, to Latin America, in particular, some countries that are not very stable, like Venezuela and some other ones, the annual U.S. Company Office and Personnel Security Bill may run well into $1 million or even higher. Special equipment, surveillance cameras, bodyguards, all that stuff costs a lot of money, and if you don't have it, there is a good possibility that some of your employees may be literally kidnapped or may be killed. And so if you want to do business in those regions, that's something that you need to account for or account for. And then finally, the parts of Indian Ocean. I'll use the Ukrainian example, but you probably can have heard about many other examples. The pirates, Somalian pirates, as well as other pirates in the region. So a Ukrainian tanker was kidnapped some time ago, hijacked with Saudi oil worth of about $40 million. A ransom was demanded, $10 million. And then it's been 3 months and still counting. And actually it's been a little bit longer. And now I know how the case was resolved. And so the owners of the vessel did pay the ransom. And so I believe one person was, one of the crew was killed, but everybody else was safely returned home after several months of being prisoners of the pirates. Again, these are purely economic decisions. I mean, not purely economic decisions. These are decisions that are not based on how long will it take to get from here to here or how much gas we'll have to burn. It's more about will we be attacked by the pirates or not. And in this particular case, I kind of like how the United States handled the situation when one of the American vessels was hijacked. There is apparently a movie being made now about that. But what the United States did, they just sent a squad of Navy SEALs and they just killed the pirates. And I'm definitely not for killing. I'm a peaceful person. But apparently in some cases, this is what you got to do to prevent the destructive behavior in the future. So some of the problems inflicted today may actually lead to fewer problems in the future. And so many people see that as a solution, and in my opinion, that would be a more effective approach than paying a ransom every time. Now let me test if you've been listening carefully. So here is your next question. What parts of the world are less risky? Now, if you're watching this video on a screen, you probably have noticed that every time I have a question for you, a question that is likely to appear on the exam, I actually have a picture of an alarm clock or some other form of clock. Every time it's a different picture, so I literally had to find over 100 of different pictures of alarm clocks. Just a side note. But yes, the most risky environment obviously is E. Now the question becomes, how can you minimize the political risk and how can you handle it? There are all kinds of approaches, and I'll give you a few examples here. One, obviously, you would like to gather as much information as possible and prepare your employees fully for the assignment. So it would be pre-departure personnel training. You have to advise them, what they should and shouldn't do to keep out of trouble. For example, at the University of Calgary, where I did my PhD, there is a joint MBA program between the University of Calgary and the Sharif University in Tehran, in Iran. And so the professors from each school go and visit the other school from time to time and teach lectures. And so I once had a chance to attend a pre-departure training for the professors from Canada going to Iran. And so they would say things like, for example, if you're a woman, please keep your clothing as conservative as possible. So you don't want to stick out, you don't want to have too much skin revealed and all that kind of stuff. And so that's pre-departure training, because otherwise you may be in trouble. Adaptation. Again, you might want to adapt in some way. For example, local equity or debt in partnerships. That's one of the approaches that some companies use. Basically, what that means is that you give part of your company or shares of your company to the local officials, or maybe local pirates or bandits, or whoever the threats may be. And so the hope is that when they own a part of your company, they would have an interest in you doing well, and so they will protect you from any problems, because if you lose, they lose. You can also localize, so you can pretend to be local. Like, for example, this is a picture of the McDonald's logo in Canada. Canadians, as you may know, they love Americans, no question about that, but they also love being Canadian and not American. And so many American companies, when they do business in Canada, they would put a picture of the Canadian maple leaf on their logo. And so McDonald's in Canada has this little maple leaf logo on its M letter to signify its connection to Canada. And so the advertisement would say something like, proudly made in Canada, or proudly served by Canadian employees. So that makes the company look a little bit more local, and then reduces hostility toward the company that would be encountered if the company was perceived as a completely foreign one. So you can also buy insurance, obviously, and you can do other things, as well as maybe lobby the politicians, or maybe support the right candidates, so that when they win and get the seat in the office, you have someone who will be looking over you. Now let's talk about something even more interesting, the legal systems, different legal systems. I wonder if any of you know what kind of legal system the United States have. There was a time when I thought that every student at UNCG knows that the United States has a common law system, but now I know that not everyone student knows that, and I guess this is probably not the type of information that you hear every day. But yes, the main types of systems are common law, civil law, and theocratic law. Let's discuss each of them with a particular focus on the differences between the common law and the civil law, since one of them is yours. In theocratic law, as you understand, that's when basically religious teachings are the law. Probably the only really examples would be Saudi Arabia, maybe a couple other Muslim countries where Quran is basically the law. Maybe Israel with the prominence of the Jewish law there, but other than that, most countries would be either civil or common law, or some form of a mix of the two. Now let's see if you can differentiate the civil law and the common law. The book has a number of pages on the topic, but I feel that the explanation is not the best one, so I selected the most important distinctions here, and I'm going to give them to you so that you know the difference. The common law, first of all, you understand that it's a precedent-based law. So the decisions on previous similar cases are the law and the directions for how future similar cases should be resolved. So if somebody conducted a crime similar to the one in question at the present time, the decision that was made on that specific case before must be followed, and the same decision must be made in this present case. The idea behind that is that it's about consistency. So fairness is everyone being treated the same way. So if there was someone 10, 20 years ago who stole $10 and he was, sentenced to 1 year in jail, if somebody steals the same amount today, the person should be sentenced the same way. And obviously it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the main idea. The civil law, in that system, the law is the book with the laws. So somebody or some people, lawmakers, got together at some time and they wrote the laws. And so for every typical or for every possible outcome, they decided what the punishment should be. And so when the judge decides on how a particular individual should be punished for the offense, the judge opens that book and looks in that specific book and sees what the book says and rules in accordance with those rules. Even if some other judge ruled differently in the past, it doesn't matter. So the main point of reference is the collection of laws, not the rulings on the previous cases. In both systems, the idea is that, it's about justice, but again, in the common law system, the justice is making sure that everyone gets the same punishment for the same offense. Whereas in the civil law, everyone gets the same punishment as prescribed by the book. So obviously the common law system is much more complicated because you have all those previous cases that you have to research. Plus, in many cases, some judges would make different decisions just because they didn't know of other relevant cases. And so you would have all kinds of conflicting kind of evidence or laws in a sense. Plus, in addition, the jurisdictions overlap, and sometimes it's not clear what cases from the past should be taken as a point of reference and which ones shouldn't be. In the civil law, the system is much simpler. So basically, as long as you know what's in the book, in the legal code, that's all you need to know. One kind of funny example from this distinction is that the lawyers are very differently actually portrayed in American and European movies. So Europeans have the civil law, and just about everyone outside the former British colonies in the United Kingdom have the civil law system. So Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States, a few more countries, again, primarily those associated with the British Empire. So those are the countries that still have the common law system and probably will have forever, who knows. Just about every other country has a civil law system. But anyway, when you look at, for example, Europe, where the law is civil, and it's not because here it's uncivilized, no, it just has civil as the title. And at the common law countries like the United States, then you would see that Europeans often find themselves puzzled or even amused or even laugh at how lawyers are portrayed in the United States movies or movies made in the United States. Here, in any movie about lawyers, you would have that scene inevitably with the promised and rising star lawyer working on a case. And so there would be always a scene when this guy sits in the library all night, with red eyes, or in the office, mug of coffee, and, like stacks and stacks of books, presumably, previous case rulings. And then, he goes through tons of that information, and then in the morning, when he has to testify or present his case before the judge, he comes prepared, and he was able to go through all those tons of literature or previous case rulings and find, the pieces of information that defend his client. You've seen that probably in just about any movie, from The Devil's Advocate to just, The Firm, and you name it. But then when you go to, Europe, there they don't get it. I mean, their lawyers don't have to go through tons of literature. All they need to do is to know this, book and what it says, and it's pretty much irrelevant what the previous rulings were in that case. So their job, in a sense, is much easier. Probably that's why lawyers there don't make that much money as they do in the United States. Now, the decisions, the options as they call it, in common law countries are long, and they cite previous cases. So when the judge makes the decision, the actual kind of document that details that decision is very long. Whereas in civil law countries, it's not the case. I mean, it basically just says, paragraph 25.3, that's, the type of offense, and this is the charge, and that's what we did. Now, in common law countries, judges are normally selected from accomplished attorneys. So a judge in the United States, that's a figure of authority and a person usually with lots of experience and lots of credibility. In civil law countries like in Europe, you can become a judge right out of college. I mean, in fact, they have programs that prepare judges. Because as a judge, again, all you need to do is really know that book with the laws. I mean, your decisions will be not that complicated, really. You will not have to listen to lawyers, talking about previous cases for days and days, and then deciding what's going to, what you're going to do about it. So it's not really that just about anyone can be a judge, but definitely you will have much less flexibility and expectations with respect to making decisions in an ambiguous environment. Now, given the complexity of the civil law, jury of peers becomes very important. I mean, even though judges are highly reputable people, but even those people are not trusted enough to make the final decision. So jury of peers become critical. Whereas, again, in civil law countries, normally there would be no jury of, there may be, but usually there are no juries of peers. And so it's so much more simpler that you just don't need that. And finally, obviously, a good attorney in a common law country is the one who can go through tons of literature and systemize it. Whereas, again, in the civil law countries, an attorney just needs to know the book, that code, and really doesn't have to be so analytical as it would be the case in the United States. Some people, by the way, credit that system, said that that's an advantage of the system. Unfortunately, in the United States, given the complexity of the legal system, the law is complex, and you have to pay a lot of money for people to be willing to do that job. And so what eventually leads to the best minds going into that profession. Whereas if the system was simpler, as it is, for example, in Europe, then the best minds would be becoming engineers and then architects and all that kind of stuff. And so again, obviously there are enough good engineers and architects in the United States, but a simpler law would probably benefit the society as a whole. So let's see if you got the idea, and if you now know what type of legal system is in the United States have. And obviously it is common law. Now, the laws are different, so what? What does it mean for you as a business person? Well, obviously that means that different laws may lead to different procedures. So you may need a different set of skills to survive in the country. There may be different. The laws may be also understood differently. So the way the decisions are made may be different. In the United States, most of the decisions are made with involvement of lawyers. If there is a conflict, my lawyer will talk to your lawyer. In other countries, it may be some kind of a backroom decision. So in Japan, for example, in most cases, it would be more senior people meeting privately in the back room and then announcing the decision for the rest of the team. So there will be no open debate or open discussion going on as it would in, for example, the United States. There may be also differences in how different areas of business are handled, particularly with respect to property rights, patents, trademarks. There may be serious differences there. So you go to a country like, for example, China, and you can buy your Windows 7 disk with all the program there for literally a couple of dollars, whereas here in the United States that would be quite unusual to find such a deal or to be able to buy a pirated copy of the software. One of the most fascinating areas where differences in laws have a dramatic impact on economy is banking with respect to Islamic law. As you may know, in Islamic countries that live by Quran, borrowing and lending money is a difficult proposition or business. Apparently, the Quran says that when you lend money, you shouldn't charge interest, and the banks take it literally. So it makes it difficult, or it provides no financial incentives or economic incentives to lend money, and so as a result makes it difficult to find someone who's willing to lend money. Indonesia, being an Islamic country, but at the same time not being in the Middle East, is kind of a pioneer in Islamic banking. So they devise clever schemes or ways of helping people with excess money to lend money to those who have need for money. So that there will be no interest payment involved in the transaction. So there would be some form of a profit sharing type of scheme, or there will be something else. And this type of business is becoming very popular in the Islamic world, as well as actually in the United States. I actually experienced that myself in some respect. I'm trying to sell a house at this time, and I had a client who was interested in buying it, but he was from one of the Islamic countries. And so he said that he didn't have enough money, and he would be happy to buy my house, provided that I would be willing to give him an extension with respect to payment. And I believe he wanted 20 years. The reason for that is because it would be against his religion to borrow money from a bank, because a mortgage, as you understand, would involve some form of an interest payment, and so that would be something that he cannot do. Unfortunately, in my case, the reason I'm selling the houses because I bought a new one and I need to sell the old one to pay for the new one. And so unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to wait for 20 years. And so eventually the deal didn't go through. But if there was some form of a payment arrangement made through a bank where there would be no interest involved, the person could have been able to buy my house. And so some banks now started offering here in the United States, offering, for example, Islamic law credit cards and other types of financial instruments that do not violate those regulations. There was a very interesting article on Wikipedia about Islamic banking, and so if this topic is of interest to you, I strongly recommend that you learn more. Now, what laws differ most, and what laws are different most from country to country? For some reason, when I ask that question, people always jump into the criminal law. They, for some reason, have this image in their head that, hand being chopped off for stealing. And so they think, well, it's not thinkable of here in the United States, for example, but it's how they do it out there somewhere. But the reality is that no, criminal law is not really that different from country to country. I mean, stealing is everywhere punishable by law. Murder is everywhere punishable by law. So there may be a difference in how much punishable, but it's generally considered, illegal to do any of those activities. But then copyright, product safety and liability, antitrust, and taxation, those are very different systems in different countries. What's perfectly legal with respect to copyright for example, in one country may be completely illegal and you can go to jail in another country. Some countries don't even have copyright laws yet. In the United States, you make a copy of a movie and you can go to jail, especially if you try to sell it then. In some countries, there is literally no law that regulates that kind of activity. Product safety and liability. A woman walks into a store, slips on a wet floor, breaks an arm, and so all of a sudden the store is liable. Or you buy a toy and the toy turns out to contain or be not safe for little kids, and so the manufacturer will need to issue a recall and pay for any damages. In other countries, that shouldn't be a problem at all. With respect to product safety, it also relates to employment standards and safety. In some countries, employees may be, easily fireable or punishable. Sometimes even physical punishment would be acceptable. In other countries, the labor standards would be much different. Antitrust, again, if you hear about the problems that Microsoft lately has, it's primarily, or Google for that same matter, it's primarily in Europe, where antitrust laws are much stronger than they are in the United States. Here in the United States, most of the laws are very much pro-business, and so unless it's really, really serious, the companies are not really in trouble. And the same thing with respect to taxation. So tax codes are very different from country to country, from income taxes to sales taxes to consumption and value-added tax and many other taxes. So those are drastically different from country to country. Now, I'd like you to pause here and watch a short video that I have on counterfeiting in China. The video is from a few years ago, and some things might have changed since then, though many agree that it's pretty much still a problem in China. So counterfeiting is a big deal, and so I have a big deal, not deal, right? Big deal in China, and I have a very interesting video about 10-15 minutes about counterfeiting in China as well as in some other regions. So I'd suggest that we pause here and you watch that video. Now, you've watched the video about counterfeiting in China, and I would like to emphasize that the problem is not unique to China, so you shouldn't think of China as the center of counterfeiting or evil. No, obviously you can see that in many other countries, particularly in developing countries where people are not rich enough to buy the original products. But you could also observe some of those problems even here in the United States. Here are a couple more funny examples, and I guess it's not really funny, but unusual examples about counterfeiting. A few months ago, there was a big story about a Apple store being knocked off in China. So rather than making fake iPads and iPhones, a company there made a fake Apple store. So they were selling genuine as well as counterfeited Apple products. But the truth was that the store itself was not an Apple company open store. So the employees actually genuinely thought that they worked for an Apple store, but the truth was that it wasn't linked to the Apple Corporation in any way. And so when eventually it became known, it led to all kinds of problems. There were also reports that the report itself was fake, but then eventually it seems like it was actually true, and there were 3 or 4 fake Apple stores opened in China. So quite amazing, I find. Now, if you think that, the problems or differences in ethics perceptions are for someone out there in a developing country, let me give you a few questions. And I truly wish you took this course in class, not online, so you could see responses of your peers. But let me assure you that these questions that I ask, there are always differences in opinions, even within the same classroom here in the United States. So it's not so black and white as it may appear at the first glance. Like, for example, gift giving. Again, what is an acceptable gift for a business partner in the United States? And when a gift becomes a bribe, what is too much? And I bet the different students watching this video have different opinions. Now, software, CD and DVD copyright. Again, we all know that pirating videos is bad. But let me ask you, how many of you have ever downloaded an illegal or copy, not the original version of a movie or music or a song. And again, whatever you are answering to yourself, that's your answer. But believe me, when I ask this question in class, pretty much everyone raises his hand and says, at least once in my life I did engage in that activity. So, and go figures, here we just all laughed at China, but it turns out that it's quite a problem here as long as you have an economic incentive. Now with iTunes, and you may be now too young to actually remember anything else, but now with the iTunes and each song being only $1, I suppose it kind of doesn't make sense to buy pirate copies. But some 10 years ago, before iTunes, I mean, the difference was huge. A CD would be worth like $17, and you could get the same stuff online for free. So what would you do? Today with the movies, I guess, Redbox and Blockbuster and Google Videos or YouTube movies, you can probably get anything for also little amount of money, and so there is no incentive to buy pirated stuff. But it wasn't like that always, and it's not that people have changed and become more conscientious. No, it's just because some of the economic incentives have been removed to buy pirated stuff. Finally, one interesting example that goes to Germany, and this one is about Siemens. Up until a few years ago, up until 1997, in Germany, bribing officials overseas to get business was not only legal, the bribes themselves were tax deductible. So in the United States, if you're a company, an American company doing business, let's say in China or in Japan, and to get a contract, you need to bribe someone there. If you do, you will go to jail. This is illegal, even if you are operating outside the country. In Germany, just a few years ago, it was not only legal, the money that you would spend on the bribe, you could actually deduct from your taxable income. And so Siemens was in trouble some years ago when they bribed some American officials to get the business. And so when Americans wanted to do something about it, but then it was kind of the jurisdiction question arose. So should they operate under the German law in the United States or under the United States law? Because under the German law, what they did was perfectly legal, and they actually were saving money on their tax deductions. So kind of an interesting story here. And so again, this is Siemens. This is Germany, and that's not your African country somewhere. What laws differ least from country to country? And the answer obviously is criminal. This is what you need to know on the exam to get your A+. I guarantee you there will be nothing else on the exam outside these issues. And so as long as you know this stuff, you should be fine. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next video lecture whenever you're ready for it.